Welcome to the Geoeconomics Podcast. I'm your host, Aleksa Burmazovic, and today I'm speaking with Lotta Moberg. Lotta is an analyst at William Blair's Dynamic Allocation Strategies team, and she has a very interesting history. On one end, she has a PhD from George Mason University, and on the other, she was active with the Swedish military intelligence in Kosovo. She's also an author of a book on special economic zones, link in the description, and she's just generally a very well-rounded person with, an appropriately rounded discussion that we had together today. We spoke about how politics influences the economics of SEZs, and then we drilled into the details of what those economics are specifically. I think this was a great conversation for intermediates and those above. Some great lessons to take away. Without further ado, here's Lotta. And here I am with Lotta. Lotta, how are you doing today?
Very well. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming on to the podcast. Honestly, Lotta, back in 2017, I believe you published your book, The Political Economy of Special Economic Zones. And that book, if I have the name right, is easily one of the most important reads that I've had in this space, simply because it changed the way I was thinking about zones from sort of an idealistic and fluffy way to more of a hard-nosed, evidence-based approach. So can you tell me more about what caused you to write that book? Was there insufficient research in the SEZ space? What sort of brought you to writing the book?
Yeah, thanks for asking. And I hope that some of your listeners will pick it up too. I'm glad it's still being used and read. I was interested in charter cities, the Paul Romer concept that I heard about. And because I came out of economics very much from interested in economic development, thinking about what policies actually work, very quickly when you start reading about these things already in undergrad back in Sweden, but certainly being reinforced as I got to George Mason University, where I got my PhD. Foreign aid is just not the key to economic development, at least long-term economic development. It becomes pretty clear. And then the question is, what can you do then? And I thought that the charter cities concept, which is one where you have these external government with better institutions coming into a place with worse institutions, kind of helping them to build it. Some people will think of it as imposing institutions, of course. That was a really interesting one, and I wanted to write about that. The direct connection was, of course, special economic zones. I thought I would have that as a kind of a backdrop and all the good research that would have been done there. Now, when I started looking into that, I realized it wasn't that much of a research field. You have people writing anecdotally about it. You had some old papers kind of thinking about in terms of labor and capital that can be mobilized into certain areas, but it wasn't really any analysis. I certainly was missing the political economy angle of it. And I really realized that this is a field where a lot of things are being done on the ground already, and people are actually not thinking about it as deeply as you would hope for it to be a really powerful policy. And that's what I set out to do. That became my mission for my PhD. And having finished that, I wanted to write a book. I didn't take the PhD pieces. You tend to write like 3 pages and package it together, but wrote it instead from scratch, very much based, however, on the ideas from my dissertation.
Well, that's a really interesting background to that. Lotta, you have the pleasure of being the second ever Swede on the podcast after Dr. Zoilen, who'd also written about geoeconomics, specifically the namesake of our podcast. So it's really impressive that we have 2 very no nonsense and well-minded Swedish authors on the podcast. I think that's quite a funny thing to be looking at. I totally agree that the economic zone space seems to be stuck somewhat in the 20th century, even though a lot of zones are very sober as far as the geoeconomic value proposition goes for what they're trying to do. Many times they're going to make completely economically inept decisions influenced by their sort of political decision makers. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about that angle of the political economy, if that makes sense.
Sure, I do think that we have seen some progress. I would credit a good bit of this to Thomas Farole, who wrote an important piece back in 2008. He was doing special economic zones work at the time for the World Bank, and really looking at the comparison between government-run zones and privately developed zones. And I do feel like now a lot of focus is on the private developed zones, because there was a realization at that time when you kind of make the comparison that this is clearly how you get more bang for your buck. It's how you can actually spur this kind of economic development on a more kind of organic basis, and the government still like it because they can kind of still control it. So that's the key to remember here with the special economic zones, how it is a tool often for a government project. And as you allude to here, as governments want a project and they want to point at something that they like, the question is then how do I best do that? And the old zones, of which we still have many in operation, of course, today, the old zones were very much government controlled and planned. So they would say, this is the location, this is the kind of industry we believe that should flourish in this zone, and this is what we're going to do it. And it was also very much based on cutting costs. So tax exemptions, tariff exemptions. That's the old model. Export processing zones is basically what people would call it, because it was based on increasing exports. And I do think today, I would say that the next generation that I would hope to see are zones that are not only privately developed, but also decentralized in some form, where you can actually have regulatory exemptions as well. And maybe I should clarify, just when I say privately developed, usually what it boils down to is the government will either designate an area or just designate a policy like, hey, you can apply for a certain area to be a zone. Developer then comes in and says, hey, I'm applying to be this special economic zone developer. The government comes back and says, yes. And then the developer is the one that sets up the facilities that is needed in the zone, invites these companies that then pay a fee to be located in there. And the government grants that they then get these special exemptions, the tax and tariff exemptions primarily. So that's basically how it works. You certainly don't make the decisions on the private level, but it's very much kind of the planning happens on the private level. And I think that's, when we think about like where are zones going and why they are pursued, we have to remember that governments will allow them to happen only if they feel they can get something out of it, of course. Can they take credit for it? Will they be able to say, I spurred economic growth, even if they actually didn't do that? And we can get into the subtleties here about how data can be misinterpreted. But that's basically the way I would look at it.
Right, for sure. I mean, it's really unfortunate that a lot of zones choose to continue their activity during even times when it doesn't make sense to do so, just because of political reasons. Now, I make a habit of not naming any names when it comes to negative case studies, but there certainly have been examples of zones overstaying their welcome. Can you speak more to the fact that a lot of these zones just keep getting money pumped into them, and political favors keep getting bought, even though there isn't an economic background or foundation for it?
Yeah, sure. And you can see that kind of in two levels. Overstaying their welcome is an interesting expression that you might have, right, in the case where it's clear that there is no economic benefit here. It's often actually not that easy to discern that, because what governments tend to do is, of course, that they try to invest in an area that they designated as their project. And anyone visiting will say, this is a successful project. You have economic, if you have some kind of economic activity, it's going to look like a prosperous zone. So maybe, there are certain examples, anecdotes where, say, they have placed a zone too far away from a port or something like that, bad road conditions. Nobody ever got there. They have to keep putting money into it. You have, one example in history, I would say, which is an interesting one, is like in Ghana, you have the Tema zone, and for a long time they poured money into it without getting economic activity. And finally, the World Bank comes in and poured a lot more money in it, and now people refer to that as a successful zone. So in the beginning, that zone would have been kind of, you would look at it and say, the government is pouring in all this money to these companies. They say they're going to build some infrastructure, and then they take the money and disappear and so on. But now something like that will be in what I think is the most common form of not making sense, which is not obviously being a failed project, because you have enough money coming in, you have enough exemptions combined with government money coming in, that it's going to look like it is a thriving area. And how do you then discern whether it's a successful zone? Often people will look at the zone and say, let's compare it to the adjacent area. What does the country look otherwise? Well, especially if you have taken resources that could have been invested elsewhere and putting into a zone, that's going to be even better for the zone in terms of what it's going to look like. But does it make sense? Well, for the country as a whole, it may very well be a losing proposition, because the money goes into projects that would not naturally have occurred. They're taken from other projects that would have been more beneficial beneficial possibly if it's spread out in the country as a whole. And you're always losing a degree of efficiency when the government is the one saying, this is the area where it's going to happen. Because chances are it wasn't the right area. But with enough money, right, with enough cutting of costs, you can make it into a profitable proposition for the companies entering, right? So that's, one thing I think you'll see a lot. People will take pictures of a zone and say, look how thriving it is. You got to look at the backdrop. You got to try to understand, okay, so how much of the resources is actually being efficiently invested in this to actually understand whether a zone makes sense or not.
Yeah, I totally agree with the fact that people never look at the backdrop of what it is the zone is achieving. So many zones set out with the idea of having spillover effects, of increasing the level of education and skills transfer and all of these things, and ESG type things. And very rarely does that happen. I think that the reason that isn't able to occur is because ESG is downstream of making money, and a lot of these zones, as we've sort of discussed, are just not economically viable enough to finance something like ESG centered activities. So generally, I'm thinking about the decision making process for how an SEZ gets made. Right now, would you say that you're more into studying the privately developed zones or the publicly ones? Because there's significant differences between the two, and I'm wondering sort of which one you have more experience with.
I have looked mostly on private zones. I've visited various zones, and what you often see is a difference is that the government zones tend to focus more on the cost cutting, whereas the private ones tend to develop more on the basis of quality of services. And a person who hasn't thought about this before may have thought it would be the opposite. The cutthroat kind of capitalists are going to want to just cut the cost, take the government benefit and then be done with it, whereas the government cares about developing things. But no, that's actually not the way it works. In a way, that's a good thing, right? I was doing quite a lot of studies in Dominican Republic where you tend to have this division between the government zones are more like very simple infrastructure things, right? Like you'd be like, they make sure you have maybe the simplest building. If it's supposed to be textile, some kind of facility for that, you have the road get in there and stuff like that. Otherwise, it's really geared towards companies that can set up anywhere and just looking for the lowest cost. Whereas the private ones are the entrepreneurs, right? They figure out that, wow, they are the ones that can figure out what actually makes sense for companies, and that's actually a much smarter way for them to make money. And there are some really nice examples of privately developed zones with all kinds of services that you wouldn't expect, such as, they'll have nice garbage collection, they'll have their own fire department and healthcare. Like if you're going to a place, I've visited zones as well in Haiti, and if you're in Haiti and you can go into a zone and they're offering healthcare, that's really a winning proposition. So you can, in a place like that, you can offer pretty cheaply services like that. So the companies then have the incentive to pay you for offering those services centrally in a zone, and it's it's a winning proposition. I think that's those kind of developments are really interesting, because I'm hopeful that the new generation of zones are the ones that are more into decentralized kind of decision making, more deregulation, not only about cutting the tax and tariff costs. So that's mainly what I've been looking at. It's interesting to draw the parallel, but I'm certainly seeing, and I'm certainly hoping that the development is towards the private zones. The government zones are hard to run. So the private, what decisions are being made on the private zone level is certainly what we can study to learn from as we're trying to further improve the special economic zone model.
Sure. And what you just spoke about, the deregulation versus better regulation and the race to the bottom scenario of constantly having to cut tax rates. This is a part of the SEZ equation that I'm really interested in studying, because if I can make an analogy, a lot of these SEZs are trying to sell a commodity like grain, essentially, by doing stuff like cutting taxes, whereas the actual goal of what they should be doing is trying to create a completely unique value proposition that can't be competed with in any way. And when we're looking at deregulation, for me, deregulation is only one side of a much more more useful coin, which is establishing best practices. And for example, one of my favorite models for an SEZ is a regulatory sandbox where you're allowing companies active in new technologies, think like cutting edge materials or blockchain and cryptocurrency and stuff like that. You're just allowing them to do their thing and experiment with their products, and then once you have this sort of safe sandbox in which they establish their products, then you're able to extract what the best practices are from the zone, and then use that as the template for policy in the rest of the country. And I'm just wondering, from your point of view, are there any particular industries that you're interested in or passionate about that explore these opportunities in sandbox type zones? For me personally, there's a really fascinating one, the Uzbek blockchain valley, which is sort of this wild west or a wild Central Asia, I guess, of cryptocurrency and blockchain and decentralized finance. There's Innopolis as well, which goes into stuff like advanced water jets and materials science, so very hard science type stuff. So I was wondering if you have any examples or industries that you're particularly looking at.
Well, I do think that you make a really, really important point there. There are two kind of ways of thinking about zones. Like, are you going to cut the cost of the industries that you're already good at, or are you going to expand the horizon? And I agree with you that when we're allowing for more kind of just opening up opportunities and thinking about zones as having that function, then you can create this kind of leapfrog opportunities for countries. What's tricky here, though, is again, often governments will then come in and say, oh yeah, we want to leapfrog. And they have this vision of where the country should be going. And this is always going to be the tension. In the end, so far, what we have is always going to be zones that are sanctioned by governments. So they need to, the current administration, the future administration, need to feel that they have a buy-in here. And what tends to happen is that a government comes in and says, oh, well, we want to be on the cutting edge of this technology, and then they're kind of dictating that. And sometimes the country is not ready for that, and it's not the most beneficial way to go. I did see this in the Dominican Republic as well, that they had this kind of computerized, IT-based zone that was going to be connected to some university and things like that, and the government was throwing all this money at it, and it seemed like there wasn't anything developed when I visited it. I know, however, that a lot of money had gone into it. But I think that when you're thinking about opening up opportunities, and you mentioned, the kind of the government's part, I think that's really important piece here, because as you mentioned, there is this, you mentioned also the acronym ESG, so that's environmental, social, and governance, these goals that investors tend to have that go beyond returns, right? That is something different from returns. And the governance piece is a very natural one. It's also one that you would think any investor, whether you want to call yourself ESG or not, would pay attention to. And this is a great opportunity, right, to enhance on that front. If you think about a country like Japan, and you think about why are the companies there often, why are they having an issue of growing? Well, they have a governance culture there that is not always conducive to growth in companies. And those are the kind of slow-moving ways of doing things that you can get out of by opening up opportunities in which special economic zones certainly can be a tool. The blockchain solutions is a good example of that. I would hope that you're not going to see governments coming in and say, we're going to do blockchain and we're going to come out with how to run this. That's, maybe we can get into this, but I mean, that's part of the kind of development where the government ends up probably front running what would otherwise be more efficient and dynamic ideas. So we see this in the blockchain space. You have the now like central bank cryptocurrencies and so on, where the kind of projects that a government will come up with, it's not going to be the projects that you think of as promoting dynamic economies often, right? It's unlikely they're going to get it as right as the private sector. So I think, the way I look at special economic zones is very much kind of sector neutral, and I can be skeptical of on both ends. And and it's often driven by the fact that if you have a more centralized decision making, meaning decision making that being taken far away from the actual people that understand the economy on the ground, that's when you can get the wrong decisions in either direction. It could be they're focusing too much on grains because 90% of their economy grain, or they're try to focus on computer when really what they should be doing is grain because that's what they're good at. It can go both ways.
Right, right. I'm not entirely sure that I agree with the sector agnostic idea, or if that's what you're saying. I think that a lot of zones are trying to pursue something like ICT, information communication technology, or a business process outsourcing. These sort of digital assisted service industries, right? And the problem is when you're Jamaica is an example of a business process outsourcing type SEZ ecosystem. You're competing with, say, the Philippines, and simultaneously you're also competing with places like India. And when you're in a place like that, when you're in a much more globalized market, then that incentivizes the race to the bottom scenario that we sort of spoke about before. Now, I'm trying to think about how SEZs can incentivize, or rather, which sectors incentivize SEZs to act more like the Emirati zones did, the ones that actually innovate with a better user interface and user experience for governance slash SEZ services, the ones that don't focus too much on tax reduction, but try to focus on ease of payment and just making sure that the government services are streamlined. And in so doing, I'm arriving at sort of a dilemma. What is it that I really want SEZs to enact? Is it deregulation? Is it better regulation? Is it just better interaction experience with existing governments and existing regulations? What is it that we're actually trying to do here with these SEZs? For me, it's something along the lines of establish new best practices, more sustainable and more money making processes, and ensure that the people who interact with these SEZs get enriched at every step. For you, what is the goal of SEZs? Because SEZs are a tool that can be used for good or ill, one way or another. And what do you think is a good as opposed to ill that SEZs can be pursuing?
My vantage point, it is economic development. And just the fact that economic development is not going to look the same everywhere. And what I mean by sector agnostic, I should clarify that for sure, the people who, if you have a private developer, that is a planner. It's a planner on a very decentralized level. And it's all a matter of like who does the planning, right? Of course, you want planning, but it can be on a super decentralized level that is any company just plans what they were doing internally. It can be on the developer level of planning, which it tends to be a pretty successful way of doing it. So one developer that I visited in Dominican Republic, for example, he wanted this lingerie manufacturer that he invited there, and then he invited also the company that makes like the wires in the bras, so that they would be closer to each other and like work in synergy, for example. So it was very much like planning from there. And if you are a private developer set up a zone, you can certainly like target create this conglomerate effect if you think that you can make that happen, and if you fail on that, of course the loss is going to be on this private developer, and it's not going to be the taxpayer who have to handle it. I agree with you that like we are hoping for better governance and all of those things. I do think that in every region and every country, it's going to be a little bit different in terms of what is actually missing, because some places, if they have a governance problem, it's often the case. Yes, what kind of governance problem is still going to be a question, and I don't think that we can really answer that question in a general sense. I also think that you're kind of getting into this kind of, well, you are going to end up competing, who's going to be the best in certain areas, and it's a question. I know that I've become very abstract in this, but like as an economist, there's always a counterfactual about what would have happened in development in a country in the absence of a certain policy, and in this case, in the absence of certain zones. And whenever we try to evaluate zone projects, we have to let it take a lot of time, often decades. And in the meantime, the world moves on, and we're never going to be able to say, what exactly did the zone do for a country as a whole? Because the country would have developed, it would have moved on in a certain direction without the zone, and we're never going to know that counterfactually. And similarly, when we're promoting, a sector, you might still find people who would say that the Soviet Union was really great because they put a man in space, and they were really good at the military part and this part. And it's like you can become, if it's, you believe that it's your goal to be best in a sector, you can do that. The question is, are you going to do that at the expense of not being able to produce a toaster or something else that might be more beneficial for economic development? And I think that when we're thinking about the higher end sectors here, it's going to be easy for us to think that that is the horizon by which anyone should be competing. And then we're going to judge countries by their success in certain areas, when in fact, some countries will be better off promoting what they're already been doing before, maybe doing a little bit away, cut out some corruption, and you can do it better. So it's going to be, that's what makes this really, really hard. I wish there was one recipe that, like, this is how you measure it, but it's going to come down to economic development. You're never going to know the counterfactual. You're going to have to look at the political economy of it, because it's going to be a matter of, well, what kind of decisions could they have made otherwise? What is reasonable to believe that the country, how the country would have developed in the absence of these policies? And as we are discussing this, we can look at examples, and it's always easy. We both can have our biases, and then we're going to disagree about, was this good or not, and none of us are going to be able to prove with data, right, exactly our point. Like, no, this was clearly a successful zone, and that was a great policy, because there are always other counterfactual that you can reasonably assume would have happened otherwise, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I mean, transcending the need for falsifiability is something that'll never happen in money making industries like SEZs, right? Because there's always one factor that we didn't account for that may have actually caused the thing. So the only thing that we can say for certain in any given case is that an SEZ has succeeded or has not succeeded, and we can only extrapolate what the correlations are as opposed to coming up with any specific recipe, right? And with regard to economic development recipes, so to speak, there's one point specifically that I take a lot of umbrage with, which is the idea of leapfrogging. I've been told several times that having an underdeveloped country leapfrog the developed ones by implementing various types of technology. Let's say that this is satellite provided internet data to all mobile users in a given country. Well, that's a problematic thing for me, because that country essentially doesn't have any of the requisite infrastructure to make any of the previous steps happen, right? So you're looking at satellite launch facilities, you're looking at advanced electronics manufacturing, just all sorts of things that need to happen first before leapfrogging of that type can happen. And essentially, this feels to me like arbitrage, like you're just shipping technology made in, let's say, the USA to Central African Republic as an example, and you're calling it economic development. I think it's a very cheap way of thinking about economic development, and not at all useful to what it is that we're actually trying to do. A lot of industries that I'm running into seem to have this zero-sum game thinking about them. They're trying to just reallocate existing funds in such a way that they have more of them, and I'm getting very disheveled by many industries with the lack of innovation that's coming out of them. So what I was wondering is, what do you see as what do you see as industries that are actually going to lead to substantive economic development, and whether or not SEZs are going to play a role in that? For me personally, I think that what I just mentioned, the crypto side of things and blockchain, etc., is going to revolutionize the world of bits, and in the world of atoms, primarily in, funnily enough, as you mentioned, the ex-Soviet bloc, there seems to be a lot of material science innovation that is going to drive us more towards sort of the space industry, to different types of IRL innovations. It's only a matter of time before materials science brings us a revolution like the 1920s, where we were able to create plastics, and then as a result of that, we just had numerous new revolutions in manufacturing. And the next one coming in is going to be nanoceramics. So it's going to be a really exciting period. But for you, what would you say are the things that you're most hopeful about? It can be individual zones or regions or industries or whatever in terms of economic development.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you mentioned, I mean, you're a skeptic of leapfrogging. On the other side, on the other hand, I mean, mentioning things like blockchain solutions and things like that. I mean, I can think about M-Pesa, for example, the payment via mobile phones that you have in several, that dominates payments in some African countries, some of the bigger ones. And that's I think is a great example of leapfrogging. It wasn't planned necessarily leapfrogging, but in terms of like a technology that you would think that if you look at the trajectory of developed countries, you'd think that they will come in much later, and you would think that payments via phones being so dominant would happen only way after you seeing it being dominant in developed world. We're still, I'm still wrote a check on paper in the United States, the other day. So I think that leapfrogging is possible. We see it in pockets, and when we do, that's a great opportunity. Or either when you see it happening and you can get on the train, or you can be a savvy entrepreneur and predict that could happen. I do think that there are a lot of opportunities, and when we're talking about these new technologies, I mean, we're seeing a lot of just mind-blowing things. Just if you're thinking about cryptocurrencies and mining and how that has spread to places where it has made sense. It depends on the conditions, right? If you are a place where electricity is nominally free, like in Venezuela, you see mining happening there. You see mining in China, as long as the government doesn't come and say, well, you can't mine here anymore, in which case they move out, which you've seen recently. So I think that you can, there'll be opportunities that if you consider the fact that the whole world and the economy of any country is a complex adaptive system, that you can really never predict the ending at any point of time. You're not never going to predict where it's going. You can still look out. I mean, I'm just hoping that the world is going to be open and free enough for entrepreneurs to look out there and see where all these opportunities are, because they come all the time. And in a place like Russia, as you mentioned, I think we've seen such a great stark contrast there between a long-going project. Maybe they've abolished it now, but what the government was trying to create this innovation zones in the middle of Russia somewhere, like not in Moscow, but like they were going to do these special economic zones to be like in the forefront of innovation. Well, it flopped because like they tried to do something that was just not conducive to the resources in Russia today. But on the other hand, I mean, when you refer to Soviet times, and as we know, the government at that time focused on certain sectors that were not for sure like a net benefit in terms of like they should have focused more on the consumer focused sectors and things like that to benefit the population rather than the military focus they had and things like that. But they had certain things like the world is it's non-ergodic, right? Like path matters. Once you're endowed with something, yeah, it may have been waste, doesn't mean that you don't have it today. So like Russia, it is interesting. I mean, that you could say that Vitalik Buterin is like a great example of this, but you've had these, Russians became really good at programming because what they would have is these computer centers where they didn't have, enough computers and electricity to so that any person could get their own computer. So anyone aspiring programmer, right, had to be really quick and learning to write code in a very, very efficient way. So therefore, you have a lot of most efficient coders coming out of Russia. And you've had the tradition there of the natural sciences and all of that. So you end up with comparative advantages that in today's world and with the opportunities that is opening up by the big any kind of blockchain solutions really, and combined really with the good sides, maybe the best side of the pandemic that we're still living through here is people opening up for how to collaborate online, meaning I really don't care if we're in the same country anymore. That does open up for any entrepreneur to take advantage of resources that are out there in the world as a whole. And if we keep using Russian example, right, like if you want that kind of talent, you can actually try to connect with people now there in a way that you may not have before. So I do think that a lot of these, like what sectors are especially interesting, it is going to be indeed the ones that where you can have a lot of collaboration on the online, we don't need to be in physical presence, because that is what also takes out the transaction cost, right? In being able to combine talents, being able to combine, if you want to think about it crudely, kind of if you think about a production function of capital and labor and human capital, you can just get the best out of those and combine it however you want, and you don't have a border anymore. Like if we see that development, then yeah, that opens up a lot. And I do think that the main barrier there, right, in this kind of rosy scenario that I'm painting for you is, of course, yeah, but what if the government stands in the way? And that is where zones can play a part, right? Any place that opens up for some forms of deregulation that you don't have elsewhere, and in that way, I would actually absolutely agree with you that it's thinking about the rules and the governance is going to be crucial in order to see that development.
And I do hope to see a lot more development. Speaking of, are there any particular upcoming projects or developments or books or anything like that you're working on?
I will have some writing projects, but early stage things. I mean, as you are aware, several of our friends are doing interesting projects around the world now, and it's great to see organizations burning up doing things in any kind of special economic zones or more kind of private cities. Really, we should probably call them space. So anyone interested in the space should really, of course, via you or me, we know people who are doing these things, connect and see what the latest things are. Because I'm not working in one of these organizations, and I know that they're moving really quickly and they're producing things and they're thinking about things. I think the best way to get in touch with that now, because it's such an open field, people are welcome to enter and to be close to the ideas. That's really the way to go, to really work directly with some of the people who are doing this, thinking about it, writing about it, and doing things on the ground.
And for our guests on the podcast who are interested in your ideas or stuff that you've written or anything of that type, where's the best place to find you up on the internet?
Yeah, you mentioned my book. It's on Amazon. So Lotta Moberg is my name. There's only one book under my name, but it's The Political Economy, Special Economic Zones. My homepage is currently under construction, but it's lottamoberg.com, where I post my research. Really, and yeah, anyone can reach out to me directly from there. I have my contact information too.
Awesome. I think this is a really interesting discussion. We went into a lot of stuff from economic development to more on the zoomed out view of things. I was hoping that we could get a bit away from the technology and infrastructure and logistics that have been sort of the staple of the last few episodes, and take a bit more of a nuanced view of what it is that we're trying to achieve in this space. So, Lotte, if you have any final thoughts or feelings that you'd like to share with the audience.
Well, I would just add also, when we're thinking about the connection between the special economic zones and kind of the blockchain world. I mean, we've seen so many interesting things. Obviously, we're now actually seeing more the implementation of property rights based on blockchains, now being called NFTs, non-fungible tokens, which is really a property right of a certain thing as opposed to like a currency that is equivalent to somebody else holding a currency. That idea is an old one, and I think that a lot of people who are looking at that are maybe being disappointed now by seeing that it creating just kind of what people are doing with this technology now is funny memes and arts. But I think about this very much, and we're in the stage of development of the first pen, right? It was filled with ink and really fancy with a big feather, something that only the rich can afford. But that's the way that the path you have to walk for development to happen, so that the first people coming into the space is subsidizing subsequent ones. We're going to see a lot of interesting developments here. But when we think about the blockchain as a technology, just like special economic zones, it's a tool, and a tool can be used for building things, and it can be used in ways that are more destructive. And I think we've seen both when it comes to special economic zones. And when we think about the spaces that are opening up and the decentralizations that are being made possible by these new technologies, we are going to still live in a world where a government is ultimately going to have to be okay with a certain development. And when they have this tool in their hand, they can use it for good or for bad. And I hope that a lot of the projects that we're seeing now are going to be allowed to be pursued. But we should not assume that anything that is called blockchain is going to necessarily be used in a way that we might be hoping to opening up new bases for entrepreneurs, because it can also be a way to channel resources in less productive ways. So I don't want to be on the negative side too much, but that's the way I think that we should always frame the discussion, that a technology like especially economic zones or a blockchain does not itself contain some kind of normative statement in it, like that it's going to be for good or for bad. It's going to be a matter of who gets to use it and for what purposes.
Agreed. I'm always extremely wary of any tool, even if it's, if it's an SEZ, if it's artificial intelligence, if it's a cryptocurrency or a genetic engineering, whatever it is. I'm always looking at how this tool can be used for good or for ill. Lotta, this was a great conversation. You're welcome back onto the podcast anytime. To our listeners, you can find us on all of the regular places: iTunes, Audible, Stitcher, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Thank you for your time today, and we'll see you on the next one.